everyone. Welcome to Community Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Camille Meir, and I'm on the events team at the bookstore. So Community Bookstore is actually celebrating 50 years in business this fall, and we credit the continued support of readers and writers for this milestone. Thank you so much for spending this evening with us. I'm thrilled today to welcome Okezie Nwọka and Adam Soto for the release of their debut novels, God of Mercy and This Weightless World, in conversation with their wonderful editor from Astra House, Danny Vazquez. Now, for just a little bit of brief housekeeping, we have enabled Zoom's auto-transcribe settings. So if your version of Zoom is up to date, go ahead and hit the live transcription button at the bottom of your screen to enable closed captions if you need them. If you have any questions for tonight's guests, please click on the Q&A button also at the bottom of your screen to submit them at any point during the event. We will be asking those near the end of the program, so please don't be shy and ask any questions that might be on your mind. There's also a chat box through which I will be posting links to buy tonight's books if you haven't already purchased them. And one quick caveat for tonight's event, we are all at the mercy of our home internet connections, so please bear with any technical issues that might arise. We'll solve them as quickly as possible, of course. And I just want to remind you that we still have a number of really excellent events coming up for the rest of the fall, the final stretch of 2021. So head over to our website, communitybookstore.net, and you can sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date. One event that I want to point out and remind you all about is that tomorrow at 7:30 p.m., we're really thrilled to welcome Gloria Gervitz for a presentation of her poetry collection, Migrations, in conversation with her translator, Mark Schaefer. That program, part of our series with the New York Review of Books, is up on our website now and also taking registrations. So now I'm just going to read a little bit about tonight's guests and we will get started. So Okezie Nwọka is the author of God of Mercy, and they were born and raised in Washington, D.C. They're a graduate of Brown University and attended the Iowa Writers Workshop as a Dean Graduate Research Fellow. They're presently teaching and living in their hometown. Adam Soto is the author of This Weightless World and is also a co-web editor at American Short Fiction. He holds an MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop and is a former Missioner Copernicus Foundation Fellow. He lives with his wife in Austin, Texas, where he's a teacher and a musician. Danny Vazquez is an editor at Astra House, an imprint of Astra Publishing House. Previously, he worked in editorial at FSG, MCD, and at HarperCollins, and in publicity and marketing at the New Press. Please join me in welcoming Okezie, Adam, and Danny to the virtual stage. Thank you so much, everyone, again, for joining us.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, everybody. So I'm really proud to have published these two writers, and I'm really excited to be in conversation with them tonight. Thank you, Community Bookstore, for making the space for us tonight. Thank you, Camille, for hosting us. Adam Soto is the author of This Weightless World, a book about the paralyzing effects of capitalism that paints a portrait of human exceptionalism and the realities we've created for ourselves and the personal reasons why we're so often reluctant to break away from them. And Okezie Nwọka, author of God of Mercy, a novel that is a celebration of tradition as a marker of cultural identity and an appeal to the value of shifting norms. I really love these two books. I love these two writers. And so I'm going to hand it over to these two now for a short reading so you all can get a sense of their incredible command of language before we get to our conversation. So Okezie, you want to kick us off?
Yes, I will do that. Thank you so much, Danny. And it's a pleasure being in conversation with both you and Adam this evening. I'm going to read from chapter 1 of God of Mercy. So let's see how this goes. There is the final truth, and Ijeoma knew it resided within her, tinier than a speck, when the blowing wind became like wings, and her feet shook the branches of a leaning orange tree, knocking Chulu's dust to the ground. It drew her upward, raising her like smoke from a burning fire, raising her to the nest of Inza birds and the first scatterings of light from Anyanwu, the divine sun. She rested there, suspended like fruit too precious to pluck, or a thought too erratic to name. She rose to the sky, and nobody was there to see it. The reasoning laid in her wind-blown wings, The pleasure lay there too, and they joined with her spirit to beat steadily, steadily, deep like the Udu, deepening that which was lifted, that which her thoughts and body followed. Her fingers stretched before curling inward towards her palms. Her chest now raised upward, then fell to greet her heart, while the prickly dots, like a million rose thorns, flashed across her left cheek, then her lips, then her right earlobe, before passing into the air, returning to its abode as she let out a sigh and magnified the wonder. Tears were trembling in her eyes, and through them Ijeoma saw a single vision printed past Igwe, the divine sky, with her lips moving, counting then recounting the faces of ancestors and the faces of those unknown, celebrating their names with promises guided by much hope, a promise of many prayers to those little ones, those whom she had not yet seen, those looking through her with truth and kindness, as she prayed and promised and felt more still than death itself. And in that stillness found the greatest of life. And in that life praised the most supreme for making anything or one possible. She closed her eyes, the sky closed too, full clouds colliding within a moment. And Ijeoma found her feet touching the earth, and clutched her hands, now warm from the evening light. And she did not understand it all, not the faint vibrations in her bones, or the smell of skybound dust, or the rupture of what was thought to be known and understood, as she heard a footless footsteps and ran through the compound to find and hide understanding, and then as Red way home. Thank you guys.
Beautiful. I love that. I feel like Jason, or I was at an event with Melissa and Terrence Hayes the other night where Terrence said, I just want to sit and leave in silence. You don't have to just like let you sit with it. But Adam, I know you got a little bit you'd like to read. I'd love to hear some of that too.
Yeah. Just kind of randomly picking a page. No. So there.
It really works that way. You can just.
Yeah. So there are these parts in the novel that are addressed to a person named Babichev, and it's an unnamed narrator, and that's one of the sections that I'm going to read. Okay. Dear Babichev, I am building a radio telescope in the mountain village of Green Bank, West Virginia. It is not anywhere we'd ever heard of, but the local girls wash their hair only once a week. And in this way, Green Bank reminds me of the Urals. For kilometers, a disk of radio silence circumscribes the area, protecting our precious telescope from any interference. The girls wash on Saturday and travel in the evening to towns outside the silent zone to watch television with friends. Come Monday, they reappear in their places of work with smiles like they've just returned from their honeymoons. By Friday, however, pouring coffee at the diner and making playful bouquets in the floral shop, they are onerous once again. These sullen faces, which are more bored than completely crushed, would not have fared well back home, I don't think. And in this way, I know I am in America, the land of expectations, of which I now have many. It is the expectation our telescope will hear an extraterrestrial signal. We will enter in coordinates and the telescope will listen to the corresponding region. Dr. Frank Drake, the man in charge of the observatory, believes he knows where he'd like to start, but I would like to aim the telescope at Moscow and listen to what you have to say. For now, these messages will have to suffice, I'm afraid. Dr. Drake told us we will begin emitting our own deliberate signals soon to compete with the awful ambient chatter we've been sending since November 2nd, 1920, when the first commercial radio broadcast slipped this earth and announced our unintelligible arrival. What shall we say? I asked him. That we know math and physics, he said. More boasting, how human, I wanted to say. I should talk. Here I go on and on about what an accomplished American scientist I have become. What about you, Babichev? Have you found your gooseberry farm yet? I had a dream the other day. You and Shlovsky had built a telescope of your own with which we were communicating in radio waves. We bounced our signals off the moon and landed them in each other's headsets. I woke to my own starved ears. Thanks.
Man, you guys, we're big finger snaps. So good. So I got some questions for you too, and I'll start with Adam, since you just read. So in this Weightless World, right? There are these chapters that are titled in the way that card catalog entries are written. These chapters, like Babachev's, not like Babachev's, it's the ones in the future. They diverge from the main plot of the book and take place in a distant future. Um, and this is kind of for the both of you. So Okezie, similarly in God of Mercy, you move around in time and use chapter headings to indicate when the novel is shifting into this sort of epistolary mode. There's something kind of disorienting in those letters from Ijeoma because they appear out of order. But this makes for like a really good second act reveal, right? So I'm wondering if you both can just kind of talk a little bit about how you arrived at this decision to structure the books in this way.
I think at first it was sort of a logistical nightmare that I had to deal with. At one point, the book was just way bigger than it is now. It's a totally normally sized book now. So thank you, Danny. And Mariah. It was a matter of, how to present an abundance of information. And one of the main characters, Ramona, is a computer programmer and interested in artificial intelligence programming and design and training, and is a data scientist. And so I really was thinking about different systems for data management, because information management is also like one of the kind of like, I don't know, apocalyptic scenarios that the novel also kind of deals with. In fact, like an information overload, that is the production of information exceeding the ability to interpret it is actually a scenario for societal collapse. And so I just was really interested in like, what are the systems that already exist? And as you said, these sections in the novel, they pertain to a Chinese astronaut named He Zhen in the distant future. And I thought that it would be kind of interesting if these sections were kind of cataloged using a kind of more archaic method. And so I followed, the kind of like Library of Congress and like how books are described in that way. But in that way, I was able actually to use the titles themselves of these sections to deliver some of the information that was then kind of removed from the chapter itself. So the title itself was an information giving source, right? Even if it was maybe gestural or directive or whatever, as opposed to narrative. Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I mean, I like to think about the structure of the novel itself as being an experiment in managing the emotional information of a set of human beings, right? I mean, I guess all novels are actually, that is the case, right? But by using this kind of technical, although simultaneously very familiar technical language, it was a way to kind of hopefully prompt the reader into becoming aware of the kind of procedure of the novel, that it's kind of like, well, yeah, these are the stories that you're being given right now, but there's a lot more information. There's a lot more stories that are that aren't on the page, but that are being alluded to kind of hint at the sort of enormity and the inaccessible enormity of human experience. And that's kind of what I was playing with. And
Yeah, I love that. It was like a late stage development, and I remember when you introduced the idea, I was like, oh, like the Dewey Decimal System, you know?
yeah,
I got it, you know?
yeah. It took many years, but like I was like sitting in like a beach house in like the Gulf of Texas or Gulf of Mexico, and and I was just like, oh yeah, there's like this whole catalog system that already exists. Like, why don't I just use that? That sounds great. So
Yeah. So Okezie, the letters and the diary entries.
Yeah. So actually, the idea to disperse diary entries throughout the novel came from an agent that I worked with on with God of Mercy at the very early stages of development. So it was Richard Abate from 3 Arts, who I no longer work with, but he suggested that I like riddle the entire manuscript with diary entries, and I thought that was a really good idea. He wanted me to make them chronological, but I decided against that because I really wanted the diary entries to be housed in in an emotional environment that was similar to the diary entry. So one of the things that I think readers will probably notice maybe on the second read or third read, if we get there, is that like the diary entries are housed in environments in the novel that are thematically similar to the diary entry and that kind of follow the same kind of emotional patterns that the diary entries are alluding to. Um, Also, I didn't want it to be chronological because I thought that like that would kind of take away from the overall structure of the novel. I thought that like if they were arranged by if they kind of I mean part of what's happening is that there's like an emotional crescendo where like the diary entries get to a point where it gets very emotionally intense and um the entries then become an access point to understand Ijeoma's emotions and what she's going through more directly. And so I thought that like by foreshadowing through the diary entries early on, I could then use that to build the kind of gusto and energy necessary to make the parts in the chapters where we're in real time with Ijeoma, I can make those more emotionally palpable and powerful. And I think it achieves that. Um, I think it does that well. So that was my thoughts with the diary entries.
Yeah, I mean, I remember kind of pushing for the chronological thing too at one point.
Right, I remember that.
Because it's just, that's the way that it's the first thought, it's kind of, but I also remember thinking like, there's a reason for this, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And there's probably multiple reasons for it. And then we started talking about it. It's like, no, yeah, you know what? You're right. Of course you're right.
The part of it is that like if someone were to tell me what I was doing in 2017, I'd be like, I have no clue. But if someone were to tell me how I felt in 2017, I could tell you I felt probably excited to turn 30, right? Like, I mean, there are ways that we remember things not in time, but in emotional states. And I think that's what I wanted to like get through with with arranging the diary entries based on emotions rather than time.
Right. Memory is not, it doesn't work chronologically.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, Okezie, really early on in our conversations about this book, you mentioned to me two really important influences in your writing that were exciting for me to hear, and especially on this project, Toni Morrison and Chinua Achebe. And you said something to me a little earlier today about the parents and the grandparents of this book, and so I think those this is it's so good. So I think these influences are really evident in the book, right? If you've read these writers, even if you know who these writers are, it becomes apparent where those influences show up. But can you just say more about what you took from Morrison and from Achebe, how you arrived at this really beautiful synthesis of those totally distinct traditions, and which directions you hope to expand on those traditions? Because I think you do that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I identify as being Igbo American. And so much of my upbringing is Africa and Igbo identity. But then so much of my identity is also being Black in America. So my parents are immigrants to the United States. So they would fall under this kind of the Achebe category, right? People that grew up born, bred in Africa, kind of know the culture, know the language, know those kind of systems. But that doesn't really correlate to my sensibility. I am someone who spent most of his life in the United States, with the exception of 3 years of middle school abroad, but most of my life in the United States, born in DC, raised in DC. And so for me, in writing God of Mercy, I wanted to bring together both of those worlds. And so Chinua Achebe is the Igbo world. I mean, that's who we dub as the father of African writing, right? And then Toni Morrison is, I think, emblematic of Black writing in the United States. And reading Song of Solomon was like one of the most life-changing moments of my entire life, right? And so I think that when it came time to kind of draw out the texture and the terrain of the novel, and I decided that Ijeoma would be a character that would fly, it was like, boom, Song of Solomon, flying Igbos, Shalimar could fly in Song of Solomon. So I'm gonna bring those elements of Toni Morrison into the text as well. And so much of it was like using a syncretic model to write across diaspora. So I'm not just writing to Igbo people of the contemporary moment, I'm also writing about Igbo people during the era of slavery, brought to the Americas, and became legends that flew back to Africa. I'm also writing to their descendants who stayed in the United States and grew up in the United States and might not be as connected to the Igbo heartland, but are still descendants of that space. And so for me, this became a project of writing about being Igbo and Black, and Igbo specifically, Black generally, across diaspora, across space and time. And so that's where those two influences kind of come in, is that Chinua Achebe and Toni Morrison both kind of embody both of those legacies so well, but I wanted to kind of put them in conversation with each other through this text so that we can begin a conversation in Black writing around hybridization and syncretism. So that's where I was going with using those two writers.
Yeah, I'm really excited by this Afrosyncretic thing, taking different sort of expressions of African culture and how they appear in the world today. And that was one of the first things that really stunned me about this book.
Which is also kind of at the heart of the syncretism or the lack thereof between of different faiths, right? Within the primary narrative. It's these sort of dualities and the conflicts that are born into it are sort of a nesting doll. I love the resonance between the religious aspect, but then also what you're saying about being of Igbo descent and Black. I think it's a beautiful kind of, there's an echo between those things.
That's a great point, Adam. And both of those things, race as is marked by Igbo identity and Black identity, and religion as is marked by African traditional practices and Christianity, are both dualistic, right? And dualism, or at least Igbo dualism, is a central theme in the novel. What do we do with opposites? What do we do with things that are seemingly opposed, but in reality, there is harmony that brings them together ultimately?
Yeah. We were talking about this just earlier today, Okezie, which is something you got into conversation with Jason Reynolds, about how Catholic saints can fly, and we call it miracle, and it's something that actually happens in the world. But when we see these kinds of stories told from other cultures, they're fantasy. It's something primitive and imagined. It's not real. And so the way that these things happen in the book, it's real. It's not myth. This is not fantasy. This is the world as it exists. So here at Astra House, I'm here in the office as is Okezie. So here at Astra House, me and Alessandra, our editorial director, we often use this term genre bending, kind of jokingly, to describe a certain type of book that excites us. It's a term that's kind of overused, maybe, and it doesn't maybe mean that much at a time when like the rules of genre are so quickly expanding. Adam, we had some pushback early on about the science fiction category, though this Weightless World is most definitively a work of sci-fi. Locust magazine says so it is. And Okezie, a book also reviewed at Locust magazine really well. It's not exactly speculative fiction, like we said. Like, this is the real world as it exists for people, but there are fantastical elements. People fly, things that you have to sort of imagine. So I'm just wondering how you both feel about these works you've written in terms of where do you expect them to show up on bookshelves? Where do you want it to show up on bookshelves? And how do you expect readers to receive these books?
Adam, you want to take it?
Yeah, I'll start. In terms of people's bookshelves, I'd like for it to be like front and center, kind of like with some candles and a little staff pick note underneath it. I think that what I've learned from reading other people's thoughts about the book, is that there's a lot of faith in it as science fiction. And I think that what that ultimately means is that, a genre distinction, like any other sort of category, means something different to different readers based on like the experiences that they have with genre. When I first started writing, I was very invested in realism, naturalism. It's kind of the way that was like sort of my entry point. And when I was searching for inspiration for something larger than a short story, I found myself going back into my earlier passions, and science fiction was there. And I really started to dig and to search, and I found beauty, and I found meaning, and I found seriousness, like just profound seriousness, right? A commitment to a vision, to a dream. And to me, what else is fiction for? Why do we spend years and years and years making stuff up if it's not to exist in a parallel space? And as I continued to live in that space and try to make of it what I could, the more and more I saw of the reality that I was already living in. And so for me, it was very difficult to separate the two. And it reminded me of something that Roberto Bolaño had said in a later interview, where he said that, that Philip K. Dick was one of his favorite writers. And that, with every passing day, he felt like Philip K. Dick was a realist and was a naturalist. And that, the methods and modes through which we live, what used to be science fiction has become the norm. And, we know this kind of like the novelty of like, Star Trek had this device and now we have that device or whatever. But it's also the way that we see the world and the way that we experience the world and we envision our place within it. When we think about like the imagination of deep time, for instance, and like an Asimov's sense or whatever, we're kind of stuck in this moment right now where, because of our political reality and because of our technological reality and because of our, cultural, psychological reality, right? That to imagine, a deep time in the future seems almost impossible, right? Given the fact that, the talks in Glasgow and, the state of the world and our environment. right? That we are thinking like, well, the best, chance that we have is that we upload our consciousness to some sort of, robot, and we jettison that into outer space, and then we call it a day, and that's how we save the human race or whatever. And so those things are happening, right? Those are conversations that we're having, at the dinner table. We might not put them in those like terms, but that we're having those conversations, and we're thinking in that space, and we're thinking in that way. And so for me, science fiction, and this particularly the first contact trope, right, was a way of not only like reflecting on the immediate moment, which is like what science fiction is always doing anyways, but it's also kind of like that there's a dissolving of the distance between our greatest hopes and our greatest fears and the right now. And that there really is there's a moment of reckoning that is upon us. And that, that was kind of what I wanted to play with. And then also there's the beauty of the right now as well, even as banal as it is, right? The conversation that's going around before the erection of the very first radio telescope, which is what that chapter that I read was about. Frank Drake ran that experiment and they didn't find anything, but in the moments leading up to that first, like, hey, are there aliens out there? There was a lot of hope that there were, back in 1959, so, and I think that we're in that moment right now again, right? I guess maybe we're always in that moment. But
yeah, it's interesting, Adam, because, and I'll get to my comments in a little bit, but one of the things I loved about your book, there was a scene where I think it was Ramona and Sevi, they're talking, and Ramona mentioned something about flying cars being something of the future. And I think Sevi, I might have gotten this wrong, but I think Sevi says, no, there's something of the past. In 1937, someone invented a flying car. You're just anticipating to see it in the future, but it's something that we've already seen. And I think that's kind of how I see God of Mercy and genre, right? That like someone hears there's a flying girl and they think, oh, this is fantasy. But like, what do we make of the fact that like there are people in the world that believe that Jesus walked on water and turned water into wine, or that there are people that believe that the Prophet Muhammad communicated with angels, or there are people that believe that Moses separated the Red Sea in half, right? Like there are all of the if the earth could talk, it would bleed stories about all these fantastical elements that have happened in the history of the world that people to this day believe in. And so I think the way I would want readers to approach God of Mercy is to understand it as a novel about belief, right? People in the story believe all types of crazy things, right? There are people who believe that a pastor can exorcise demons from child witches, whatever that means, by the power of his voice and by imprisoning those children and abusing them. There are people who believe that the goddess of the earth will destroy an entire village if they don't make sacrifices to them. To the goddess. So I think for me, I think genre is category, and categories are elusive. I think for me, it's more about what do we believe about a text? What do we project in our beliefs, and what do we accept from the text as true?
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. I always think, as a book editor, you're kind of in the middle of craft and commerce, and I think how much of this is marketing? Like genre is marketing. These are not real categories that don't really exist. People write and it's good or it's not, and it makes you feel something or it doesn't. And you guys are amazing. So Adam, from the first pages, right? It's the first images in This Weightless World. There's this sense of mourning, for a bygone era of a city that Sevi, the protagonist and the narrator, once knew, Chicago. And you're from the suburbs of Chicago, and I think there's some other parallels between you and Sevi, and maybe some of the other characters. But there's also a parallel between the kind of gentrification happening in the Bay Area section of the novel and in Chicago, as in many big cities across the country, like here in New York, as any New Yorker might tell you. So can you just say more about this sense of loss that comes across in the text? Is that how you experience Chicago when you're there? And how much of these concerns played a part in writing this book? Did you begin with those concerns, as those first pages might suggest, or were there wider concerns that compelled you to write this story?
Yeah, I mean, you're hitting on a pretty central theme. You know, when I have visited the, you know, or the various neighborhoods of the novel, you know, my different family members have lived there, and it, you know, it's probably like a thing that's pretty familiar to people, to go back to like the old, you know, this is where, you know, this was my first apartment, or this is where I met, you know, your father, or this was, you know, your cousin's place, or whatever, you know. And so experiencing that kind of, you know, across generations change is always really, really drastic. You know, and you'll, depending on the person that you're walking around, driving around with, they'll be like, oh, this place is really nice now. You know, or they'll be like, oh, it's the same, like that's that same guy. That's the same guy. Don't go talk to that guy. Well, you could talk to that guy. He's all right. But don't talk to that guy. You know, but there's trauma in that, right? You know, there is, you know, the experiences, the stories that are wrapped up in it, and then the erasure of it, right? And for me, you know, when I was, you know, temporarily living in Chicago myself, you know, I was a part of an army of gentrifiers in my own right. You know what I mean? Like I was not native to a neighborhood, and you know, I was a part of the change. You know, and whether that's a different generation of people, or it's a different class of people, a different race, ethnicity. You know, and there's always this. It's obvious. You know, it's this obvious. That you're participating in something that is destructive, that is harmful, that is reckless, that is selfish, right? But that is also supposedly baked into the way of life. You know, neighborhoods change. You know, these things. It's just the nature of all things, right? And so for me, you know, and I'm glad you know, and for Sebi, right, who feels very similarly about this, is that, you know, it's at what point do you stop participating in it? And then what are the costs of no longer participating in it? And then what are the tools and what are the methods for rejecting it and for resisting it and for reversing it? And then is there such thing as a responsible way of doing it? You know, there's this whole, you know, conversation that is built into something that is rooted in guilt and shame, and as it should be, right? And there's a way that this is also a part of a larger, and in some ways less important, theme of the novel, which is change in and of itself, right? And the nature of change, and the losses that we grieve privately or publicly, and because, you know, activism and protest is such a huge element of the novel as well, that we have, you know, ceremonies for this kind of loss, but that none of that is as important as a person who loses their home, as a person who is actually displaced. Nothing is more important than the experience of knowing that you are an active participant in displacing a person, right? And And that's the thing, that's the sort of dance that the characters sort of do. They're conscious of the things in the sort of abstract, even though they're concretely involved in it themselves, right? They, Sevi moves in with Ramona to San Francisco and does it all over again, right? And he has a lot of things to say about it. He's very vocal about it. Lots of boisterous protest, very rhetorical. But does that change any of the way that he behaves? Not really, right? And it's that discrepancy. I'd hate to call it irony because that seems like inhumane, but that discrepancy that is sort of central to it, and a part of the narrative.
Yeah, one of the things that this book helped me work through is this idea that justification isn't a process of change, it's a process of displacement.
Yeah.
Right. And so things do change, but displacement is something imposed. And so it's not something that changes at an individual level. And so that should shift our idea of what responsibly living in a city looks like, right? Responsibly living in a changing city. It's what Sevi's kind of struggling with. It looks like civic engagement and a concern for your neighbors and those who lived there before you and those who lived there after you. The book really helped me work through a lot of those ideas. Thank you for that, Adam. So Okezie, on the subject of place, right? Ichulu it's an imagined village in Igbo land, and you identify as Igbo American, as you said. Can you just say more about your decision to set this book in an imagined village which exists in a real region of the world? So Igbo land being this, like, what we understand is a collection of nations that exist, today. What's your relationship to that region and to those people, and how did you come to identify as Igbo American as opposed to a specific nationality within the region?
Yeah, that's a great question, Danny. So I didn't want to give, in throughout God of Mercy, there's no nation mentioned, right? So we know it's an Igbo land, but we don't know what country it takes place in. And a part of my reasoning for doing that was because as someone who is about liberation and anti-colonization on so many levels, I didn't want to give more gas to the nation state that is Nigeria, because I see Nigeria as a colonial enterprise. And I didn't want that to have any space in the book. I wanted this to be a book about Igbo people, for Igbo people, by Igbo people, that celebrated the land and the recovery of that land outside of the colonial gaze. And so for me, imagining Ichulu, part of that was trying to, in the process of trying to recover tradition and culture, imagining Ichulu was really about just that, recovering traditions and culture that were taken away through colonization. And also part of it too was, a part of it was trying to tell a story where changes were happening in Igbo societies that weren't a reaction to whiteness or white colonizers. Like, it was really important for me to create this space that avoided colonization by any means necessary. And Ichulu kind of came out of that. It was like, what does it mean that there could be a Black space, an Igbo space that was not colonized? And what does that mean for growth and progress and innovation? My relationship to Nigeria is mixed. I do not identify as Nigerian or Nigerian American, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that it's multifold. Part of it is that Igbo people are still oppressed in Nigeria and still marginalized in Nigeria. A part of this is because of the Biafran Nigerian Civil War of the 1960s and 1967 to 1970, where Igbo people there was a genocide against Igbo people in the northern region of the country that has yet to been reconciled in the country. And so Igbo people are still marginalized. There literally is currently a resurgence of the Biafran movement to have Igbo independence be something that's actualized in the Igbo heartland. And so for me, being Igbo American is about Igbo identity that's rooted in the land, in the culture, and the traditions that leave space for growth and improvement and evolution, um, but is antithetical to colonization and imperialism.
Yeah, there's so much of that that like immediately occurs to me as I read, and that I really hope comes across to readers. We actively avoided saying Nigeria anywhere, like even in like the
Yeah.
metadata. Like it's a point that we're actively trying to make. This is Igbo land, and you should think about Igbo people and how they show up in the world now.
And also,
So
I also wanted to like make the point that like Igbo, like the Gullah people of South Carolina are Igbo people. And
yeah.
so like this story could be their story, right? It's not bound by national identity, it's bound by ethnic origin.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is my last question, and it's for the both of you. So both these books have an expansive cast of characters. Okezie in God of Mercy, we even included a list of those names and their relationships to one another in the front matter. It's a sort of early indication of the differences between the family and community structure of Igbo life and Western practices. If you see this cast of characters and their relationship to each other, you understand you're getting into something. Yet there's a consistent narrative voice in each book. In God of Mercy, it's Ijeoma. In this Weightless World, it's Sevi. Can you both just tell us how you arrived at the voice of these characters, how you decided whose voice will narrate, and how much of these voices are informed by your own voices? How much is informed by observing others?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, Sevi is a central character, and his sort of temperament and his consciousness are affect the other parts of the book, and I think that the novel is definitely sort of centers him and places characters revolving around him. But again, to go to an earlier point that I was raising, that a lot of it was about information management. And I did see the different chapters, the different movements of the book as being sort of distinct from one another, although they are kind of catering to this central narrative about the kind of emotional evolution of this one man or whatever. But I experimented at times with a very distant kind of narrative voice, that it was sort of like, well, if we were just gleaning this information from a database, like how in depth would any of this stuff get, and probably not much. But then I also started to think about how potentially in the future, when we update our archiving efforts and our sort of archival technology, that perhaps we could create a system that is a little bit more empathetic, that is a little bit more insightful, and that perhaps in the future, when people look back at us and are saying like, what the hell were those people thinking and doing to each other and to themselves, that there would be as much empathy in it as the sort of conventional novel, right? We go into these big epic novels like hoping to enter into the inner lives of characters, and I guess a part of my responsibility as a novelist is to do just that, but simultaneously I think it's coming from a pretty like hopeful place where on a long enough timeline with enough information and enough context, you know, people or machines or aliens, you know, will look back on us and read our lives in the same way that we read novels today. And so that it kind of came full circle where I was like, huh, maybe this won't be as experimental as I originally planned. So.
Yeah, and I think for me, it was actually about lived experience. When I was in middle school, I went to school in Nigeria. So I was in Abuja, the nation's capital. And one thing that's common in Abuja and other metropolises is that children from more poorer regions were sent to households to be servants. So in my household, there was, I think she had to have been maybe 7, 8 years old, a servant child whose parents sold her to my guardian, and she would take care, and she was a domestic helper. She would take care of the cleaning and the cooking and all the chores and those kinds of things. And her name was Ijeoma, and her life to me was fascinating. Like, what does it mean that there's this child that's taken from her family, sent to live hundreds of miles in the city, doesn't really speak English, is quiet all the time. I thought she was mute from most of my knowing her, because she never really spoke and never really said anything. And what does it mean that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of children like her in the city? So for me, Ijeoma was really, writing her was like writing this protest novel about the plight of children in West Africa or in Igbo lands, that where their voices are taken from them and they're put in these very harrowing and compromising situations where their life is at stake. One of a neighboring household had a domestic help that was accused of being a witch, and she was abused. And so what does it mean that, like, these stories exist for me, it was about not just naming the fact that these stories exist in the world, but like showcasing them and making it just as real as anything else that we encounter in the 21st century. And so that was kind of my engagement with Ijeoma, and really all the characters, was really writing a story that showcased the problems of Black life, of Igbo life in the contemporary world, especially with children in those communities as well.
Yeah, thanks for that, you too. That was great. Really full. We're gonna pass it over to Camille for some crowd Q&A.
Awesome, thank you. So here's a first question from an attendee. For both Okezie and Adam, was it difficult to maintain the momentum of your plots while playing with all these complex structural and formal elements, like incorporating the Dewey Decimal System for Adam, or with Okezie interspersing diary entries? Did you both feel like you wanted to do more than just deliver uninterrupted plot-fueled novels?
For me, it was pretty straightforward. I actually put in the diary entries after the plot had been written out, so it wasn't as crazy as it seems on the page. So it was pretty straightforward. I think my process is to just write what I can write, and to go back and do revisions and incorporate different elements as I see fit. And so I think I had all of these elements kind of in the back burner as I was writing the original plot and the original sequence for the text. And then over time, I wove in all these elements to then augment the plot as it stood on the page.
Yeah, and I kind of at some point arrived at these different characters and their different threads. And so for me, the plot was actually trying to articulate the way that these disparate stories were interconnected with one another. And so that was a lot of the sort of finessing and revising and reconsidering, so that it didn't feel necessarily farcical or contrived or something like that, but rather that these things could naturally sort of coalesce in a way that resonated with some of the more central themes of the novel, and achieve some sort of narrative, I don't know, conclusion. Yeah.
That's very interesting to hear how it comes together for the two of you differently. And kind of in the same vein, another attendee wants to know, is curious about if there were any chapters or passages or any like parts of each of your novels that were particularly difficult to render or figure out.
Yeah, there were two parts like that for me. The first part was Ijeoma enters the evil forest to save a child, and I had no clue how I was going to do that. Like, what is like? I was like, how am I going to write these scenes with her entering into the evil forest? Would it be challenging? Would it be difficult? I wanted it to. When I was in my MFA program at Iowa, they told me to make it a challenge for her to find the child, and I didn't know how I was going to write that. And so that took a lot of time and effort in playing with stream of consciousness and narrative style. The other part that was very difficult for me to write was the scenes with her in prison. I just wasn't sure how I was going to like showcase the fact that she was in prison for 3 weeks, showcase the fact that she was starving and kind of her own existential crises that happen while in prison. So I think the higher the emotional pitch, the more challenging it is to write. I think that's what I'm kind of saying here.
Yeah, and those were particularly poignant parts of the novel too. I think actually like the section that I read earlier, the Babichev sections were, at one point they were just like their own through line. There was just as many Babichev sections as there were any other, and so kind of picking the parts that I thought would carry that story along, but like limiting each of the entries to be about a page to a page and a half, was kind of the hardest thing to do. It required a lot of rewriting. It wasn't just a matter of like being like, oh yeah, this is the good part or whatever. And so and also, you know, writing from a completely different culture. I mean, I do plenty of that in the novel, but thinking about, you know, a Soviet defector living in, you know, late 1950s United States, you know, who's an astronomer, you know, it's very, very difficult to articulate that voice. And it's in first person too, so like articulating that voice was also quite challenging.
And to kind of tie that in with a couple audience members are very curious what your follow-up projects are. So it'd be great to hear, like, maybe based on whatever challenges you guys had to deal with or what things you got out of your system with these first novels, like how does that relate to what you're working on next, whatever you can share with us.
That's such a great question. So my next project that I've been playing with, I have it draft out. I'm like still doing revisions. It actually takes place in the United States. There's a college student who goes to university thinking that college will be his saving grace, and provide everything that he's looking for in life. But the reality sets in and it turns out that that's not true. And he has to figure out what to hope for now that the American dream has been dismantled in his reality. And so I think, and it's a very minimalist style. Like it's God of Mercy is very maximalist. There's a flying girl. The sentences are like pages long. There's like warring gods and a Christian church that's doing crazy things. There's like so much going on in the space. And I think because it's set in Africa, right? Like I think it needed to be maximalist. It needed to be very loud and bold. But I think in my next project, I wanted to be minimalist. It was very intentional. In fact, I would write haikus before going into the writing sessions because I wanted to reduce the amount of information I was giving readers because Blackness in America is seen as so common, it's seen as commonplace. And I wanted to limit access to the ordinary, to give it more mystery and give it more depth. And so it's a story about, literally about hope, about what do we hope for if we can't hope for the American dream? What do we then look forward
to? That's incredible. I love the maximalism to minimalism. That's so brave. Oh my gosh, so brave. I cannot wait. You'll have to share drafts with me.
Oh my gosh, I totally will, Adam.
I, on the other hand, I will be back on my bullshit. And Danny and I are working on a short story collection, wrapping it up. It's called Concerning Those Who Have Fallen Asleep. And they're ghost stories. They're ghost stories. So it's that play with genre again and seeing what can be done with it. Different voices, lots of different first person narrators in that one. But breaking it out into little digestible nuggets. So yeah, that's what I'm working on. Yeah.
Well, thank you both so much. I think we're just about out of time for tonight. This was a wonderful conversation. Yeah, those of you at home who are watching, please consider purchasing copies of God of Mercy and This Weightless World from Community Bookstore. Yeah, they seem like wonderful books, and you guys should definitely do that. So we hope to see you all at another virtual event soon. And thank you for joining us, and have a great evening, everyone. And thank you, Okezie, Adam, Danny.
Thanks, Camille. Thanks, community.
Thank you.
You.
I'll see you.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
See you.
All right. Bye.
Bye.